My name is Helen, and I'm an assistant curator in the media sales and licensing team at the Imperial War Museum in London. And it is my absolute pleasure to be here this evening to talk to you about the making of They Shall Not Grow Old. So I've got about 20 minutes to chat and then about 10 minutes to answer any questions that you might have. So I just thought I'd give you a little bit of a background to the Imperial War Museum and its film collection, and then kind of discuss in a bit more detail how the IWM and 1418 now came to commission this film with the help of Peter Jackson and his team. So, to begin with, the Imperial War Museum was founded on the 5th of March in 1917, and although the First World War was going to rage for another year, it was recognised at that point that Britain and its empire needed a permanent memorial to all of those who had fought and died during the conflict. So the intention was to collect and display as much material as possible to record both military and civilian experience, and that we should recognise all sections of society and their sacrifices during the conflict. With the outbreak of the Second World War in 1939 and then the outbreak of the Korean War in 1953, the museum's remit was then extended to cover all conflicts which involved British and now Commonwealth troops. So our remit extends from 1914 all the way up to the present day, and we are still collecting. As such, this means the museum has an incredibly unique collection of films, documents, sound recordings, photographs, kind of stretching across the 20th and the 21st century. We've been collecting films since the museum's inception. It was recognised even in 1917 that it was an important historic record, and should be kept alongside all of the other items that the museum was going to collect. The IWM Film Archive is the oldest in the UK, and it's one of the oldest in the world, with over 25,000 hours worth of material. Covering conflicts from Boer War, as I say, right up to the present day. Official films from the First World War, some of which you have seen today, are shot on what a type of camera called a Moyen Basti. Unfortunately, I can't show you any slides, but it's probably about the size of me when it's on a tripod. It was huge. These were hand-cranked cameras. They were incredibly cumbersome, and as such, the cameramen were not able to be very mobile while they were filming, which means that we see a lot of panning shots and a lot of close-ups of soldiers' faces or of weaponry, because the cameramen were just not able to move around with this huge piece of equipment. These cameras would take rolls of 35mm film, which they take about 100 foot, which is roughly a minute or so at a time, and then these would be edited together later on when the films were sent back to the UK. So, the other thing I need to mention is that the official cameramen did not have access to colour stock footage, hence why all of the material was shot on black and white. And the ability to shoot combined sound and print was not invented until the late 1920s, which is why all of the First World War collection is mute. There is very little footage of the British Armed Forces in action from the first 18 months of the war. There are a couple of reasons for this, but at the time there was no singular organisation responsible for filming on the Western Front. There was also British officials weren't hugely keen about the idea of having cameramen on the Western Front. They felt that it could potentially cause a security risk, and in fact they blocked all access to the Western Front until July 1915. Attitudes did begin to change, however, with the release of the documentary shot by two cameramen by the name of Geoffrey Malins and J.B. McDowell. They shot a film called The Battle of the Somme, and this was released in cinemas around the country, and more people went to see that than they did Star Wars. So you can imagine how popular this film was back in 1916 when it was released. The commercial success of that film gave way to other big kind of documentary filmmaking, but even with that success, there were never any more than 5 cameramen on the Western Front, and that's just the Western Front. That doesn't even begin to cover the other fronts that Britain was involved with during the First World War. So I just kind of want to give you a bit of an understanding about some of the limitations, if you will, of the First World War in terms of the film collection. And they're not limitations in the sense that it means that the material isn't any good. It's just that we kind of have to put it into context of the time and what was possible at the time with filming. So, in 1917, kind of the big picture documentary, the desire to see those screened in cinemas began to fade, but the War Cinema Office Committee entered into a deal with the Topical Film Budget company to create topical budget newsreels, and these newsreels would be played in cinemas before the main feature, and these newsreels were made up predominantly of the actuality footage shot by British official cameramen. So the film that these men were shooting still continued to be really important and was a way of the War Office to engage with the public and show them what their husbands and brothers and sons were fighting for and going through on the front line. So, I'm just going to talk really briefly about a little bit of background to 1480 Now and how the IWM came to work with them to commission this film. So, as the centenary of the First World War approached in 2014, the UK launched its art programme to commemorate the conflict. This was headed up by 1480 Now. And the organisation worked with arts and heritage organisations across the UK to create what is now totalling 420 new pieces of artwork from artists, filmmakers, directors, sculptors, all of whom have been inspired by the period of 1914 to 1918. IWM and Peter Jackson have been in some discussions for a number of years now. Peter has a very keen interest in the First World War, and he's been interested in the archive for a long time. So with the creation of 1480 Now, the centenary of the First World War, and the fact that Peter has this kind of love and passion for the project, he has access to technologies that we can only dream of. And the fact that he has a seriously impressive track record as a director of reaching mass audiences, IWM and 1480 Now thought that he was the perfect person to tell this story and to bring these stories of the men who had lived, fought and died during this conflict to life. So that's how the project came to be. And then in terms of how Peter kind of approached the film, finding a way of making a 20th century conflict relevant to a 21st century audience was going to be quite a challenge. And Peter had a very keen interest to make it specifically relevant to teenagers. So his approach was very simple. He wanted to see everything that we had, which was a little bit of a problem for us, but you can understand that when he's trying to figure out how he wants to tell this story, the more material he can see, the better. So the IWM sent him approximately 100 hours of film from our collection. And I'll talk a little bit more about the technologies he used in a little while. But ultimately, after he had seen the footage and the way that these soldiers' faces had been captured, he decided that he really wanted this film to be a film about them and their lives and their experiences, and not a history of the First World War. As such, he then wanted them to be able to narrate their own story. So he came back to the IWM and he came to the BBC, who also has a substantial holding of First World War interviews. They are interviews with First World War veterans made in the 1960s. The BBC ones relate primarily to a programme called The Great War. So Peter was very keen to listen to these so that he could find the best voices to help narrate this story. So that meant sending him an additional 600 hours of material for him to sift through. What became very clear to him was that these veterans are not politicians, they're not generals, they are everyday soldiers talking about their everyday experiences. And again, this really helped cement the idea for him what the film was going to be about, that it was going to be this very personal experience of the First World War. And then the kind of, well, how were we going to narrow this down? Obviously, the First World War was fought across many different fronts involving soldiers from across the world. Well, ultimately, it was decided to focus down on the Western Front because that is where the large proportion of our film collection focuses on. And again, that is because that's where the most cameramen were based throughout the war. So that's kind of how we've got to telling a very personal story about the soldiers who were on the Western Front. So Jackson decided that he was going to edit the audio first. He wanted to kind of figure out the flow of the story using interviews, and then he would find the film to match those sequences. So he kind of focused in on the what's the word I'm looking for? Kind of the structure of the original interviews, and these would tend to follow all of the similar lines, so kind of recruitment, training, through to being sent over to France, and then into the trenches, and then what it was like for them when they came back home. So he decided to use that structure as to how he was going to build his film. He also noticed the kind of the repetition of various different topics, things like the type of food these men were eating, the mud, the conditions they were living and fighting in. So he decided to allow some space kind of in his narrative to explore some more of these topics. He would then find the audio that was either kind of the most succinct, or kind of there's some dark humour in the film. I'm not sure if you spotted any of that. So he would find kind of the most relevant audio interviews to put into the narrative at that point. And he would only pick a topic if they were discussed across multiple interviews. He wanted this to be a truly universal story. So again, as long as it was, he wanted it to be that it didn't matter whereabouts on the Western Front you were eating the same food and you were living in the same mud, etc. So that was kind of some of his logic. In the end, this meant a total of using 120 different audio interviews, and I think that also helps make it a very kind of universal feeling film as well. So let's talk a little bit about the technologies. So the IWM kind of supplied the footage to Peter. As I mentioned, we supplied him with 100 hours of film, and this was quite a challenge for us. So our then head of preservation set about trying to identify every First World War film that we had an original camera negative for. Most of our First World War collection had been scanned to what we refer to as 2K DPX scans, which are a very high resolution digital scan as part of an EU directive in the early 2000s. Again, we did this kind of in preparation of the centenary of the First World War. And Peter originally was very interested in using the footage as a 4K scan. But after he'd done some comparisons between the two, he realised that actually the 2K was going to work much better. And this ultimately comes down to the fact that this footage is 100 years old, and what we can do with film now has seriously increased since what we could do back then. And basically the pixels don't exist in the original film from 100 years ago. So when you scan that film at 4K, effectively what you're doing is showing all of the imperfections of the footage rather than actually bringing out the detail. So he decided to stick with the 2K scans. And so we sent these over to him on what we call LTO tapes, which are big hard drives, basically. And that was about 100 terabytes. So you can imagine just kind of the sheer size of this. So we sent those over to New Zealand, and then Jackson really wanted to see what he could achieve, and he mainly wanted the feel to be that this footage was shot yesterday, and I think you can agree he's done some quite impressive things with the film in terms of improving the quality. I think when the transition goes from black and white into colour, you can kind of really see how much work has gone into that footage. So let's talk very quickly about some of the colorisation. So originally the scans were sent to the Park Road post-production studios in Wellington, New Zealand. They did kind of a levelling pass, so they got as much information from the black and white scans as they could. They'd sharpen up the image, and then when Peter was happy with those, they would then be sent off to a company called Stereo D for the colorisation. They worked with a historian who would provide notes shot by shot on the original colour of the uniforms and what regiments they would be, and basically a kind of an idiot's guide to what these colours should be. The production team also went out to the Western Front and took thousands of colour photographs, again to act as reference. And I don't know if any of you know, but Peter Jackson is a First World War nut, and he has a lot of uniforms and memorabilia at his own disposal. So he would allow his production team to wear these uniforms, and he encouraged them to go out into the sunlight and kind of see how these colours changed in different lights, and make sure that the colourists really understood what they were working with. There is no one singular colour in the film. The lows, mids and highs have all been individually coloured, which means that It's a really rich kind of colorization process, and nothing can singularly be defined as just one color. Sorry, I'm aware that I'm talking a little bit too much, and I want to make sure that I've got as much through for you as I can. Stereo D were also then responsible for the conversion of the film into 3D. Part of that process is that you take two slightly offset images, one for your left eye, one for your right eye, and then when you wear the special glasses that we've all been wearing this evening, your brain then puts them together to kind of give you the kind of the illusion of depth on the screen. So Stereo D was also responsible for the 3D conversion, and then the final part of the process was Peter Jackson was very keen to bring out the kind of the sounds and the noises that these soldiers would have experienced in the same way that he wanted to show that these soldiers experienced the war in colour and not in black and white. So he spent a lot of time working with a group of forensic lip readers, which is why you can sort of hear odd little snippets of conversation when these soldiers are looking to camera, you know, kind of, look guys, we're going to be on the big screen, and hi mum, and that sort of thing. So he spent a lot of time looking into that. His sound team also went to the New Zealand Army do their own live firing sessions, and they got permission to go out and record them firing some very large shells. So they microphoned all the way around where the guns were firing from, kind of over a ridge that these shells would be going over, and then in the area that they would be landing, so that they could get a really kind of rich sound when they were putting the film together. And they did lots of layerings of sound as well, so they would record soldiers marching through mud, and the wind in the trees, and birdsong, and all of those sorts of things, so that when you come to watch this kind of incredible final picture, you're getting a really kind of detailed and layered look at what it really would have been like for these soldiers who were fighting during the First World War. So I think that's probably me for time, but if anybody would like to ask me a few questions, we've got a few minutes.
They have all this audio recorded using the New Zealand Army the facilities.
Yeah.
But then did they visit the real venue of the war during that time?
Yes, so they did go out to the Western Front, and that's when they took kind of lots of colour photographs of the areas in which these trenches would have existed, again, purely to act as reference. I mean, every individual blade of grass you see, every leaf on every tree has been hand drawn and hand colorized into these images. So yeah, so they spent a lot of time kind of experiencing the actual locations as much as they could. Very welcome, thank you. Anybody else? Hi.
I just have two questions. First of all, is there any particular reason why maybe IWM or the producer choose to use 3D technology to present the whole pictures? Because I think 2D is probably still the way, but is there any particular reason they pick 3D? And also, I noticed that in these early footage, they usually be in really high FPS. So, other than just slowing down the FPS, is there anything that he compromised in between? Because I think the frame rate is pretty low compared to modern days technology. So, is there anything he did?
So I'll answer the frame rate question first. So again, the First World War collection is shot on hand crank cameras. And as such, the speed would vary from cameraman to cameraman. So Peter found that some of the footage was shot on 14 frames per second, some at 18, and the frame rate that we're most familiar with today is 24. So what his team did, and it's quite a sophisticated process, when I kind of was reading into this I was seriously impressed, they would take they would work out the original frame rate of the original kind of shot that they were going to use. They would then get the computer to convert that to 24 frames per second so that the whole film runs at a very smooth rate. And what the computer then does is it actually copies the original frame, and it puts one in front of it and one after it, and then it will kind of merge that motion all together. So if you have a shot that is shot at 13 frames per second, the computer will kind of generate enough additional frames to then make it into 24. Your other question about what 3D, why we chose to go to 3D, I think that was mainly down to trying to engage with a new audience, and I think 3D technology is something that we're all very kind of, well, it's very prevalent at the moment, and because there was a desire to connect with a younger generation, I think the museum wanted to put it out in a format that might do that in a slightly different way than a 2D version would. But we did do a theatrical release in 2D as well as 3D. Okay.
I have a question regarding the narrative, because the version we're seeing now is mostly a collective narrative, but told by multiple first point of views. Is there a reason behind using multiple personal views to talk about this collective memory?
Yeah, I think the museum's always had a real passion in telling people's kind of individual stories. I think we've come a long way in kind of describing history as, I don't know, Hitler invaded Poland on this day. I think we're now much more interested in kind of people's personal experiences. And again, going back to this idea of Peter wanting it to be a really universal film, and so that it didn't matter whereabouts you were, and even to a certain extent whether you were on the Western Front or not, that you could find a piece of audio or one person's interview or particular experience that, although it was universal, you would relate to it on a much more personal level. So does that answer your question? Great. Okay. Probably one more. Yes, sir. I think just at the back.
Thank you, Helen. Fantastic job.
Thank you.
Just now you mentioned a bit about the difficulty of getting the sound of the Royal Artillery shells and guns going off.
Yes.
As a member of the Royal Artillery, please tell Mr. Jackson he did a fantastic job.
I will do.
Not just the guns going off, but with the air being moved, with the shells coming over. It worked wonders for me, I tell you.
Oh, good. I'm really pleased to hear that. I know that he and his team spent a lot of time kind of looking at the explosions on the original footage and how they could make them kind of as realistic as possible. And then obviously during the 3D conversion process, some of that, the film is technically stretched during the 3D conversion process. So I know that a lot of time was spent making sure that all of that was looking as realistic as possible. So I'm very pleased to hear from yourself that you approved. Thank you. I think possibly one more, and then I think we might have to go. No? Lovely. Well, I really hope you enjoyed the screening. Thank you very much for staying to listen, and if you do have any further questions, I'll be around. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.